Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all here this morning to our joint House and Senate Ag Committee hearing. I want to welcome everyone to be here. Thank you. State Senator Elder Vogel from District 47, Beaver, Lawrence, and Butler counties. So at this time, we're just going to have Chairman Cowser introduce himself, and the rest of the committee members can introduce themselves as well.
Good morning, everyone. Representative Marty Causer. I'm the Majority Chairman of the House Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee. I represent the 67th Legislative District in McKean, Potter, and Cameron counties.
Good morning, everyone. Representative Eddie Day Pashinsky, Luzerne County, 121st District, Democratic Chairman of the Ag Committee. Thank you.
Good morning, Representative Sid Kavulich, 114th District, and that's Lackawanna County.
Pam Delicio, I represent the 194th, parts of Philadelphia and Montgomery counties.
Good morning, Dave Millard, 109th District, Columbia County.
Representative Dave Zimmerman, northeast part of Lancaster County.
Morning, Representative Russ Diamond, 102nd District, that's Eastern Lebanon County, and proud prime sponsor of the Industrial Hemp Bill last year.
Good morning, everyone. Representative Dan Mal from Adams County, 91st Legislative District. Good morning, gentlemen.
Representative John Lawrence from Southern Chester County, part of Lancaster County as well.
Good morning, Representative Rich Irvin, serving parts of Center County, Huntington County, and parts of Mifflin County. And I would like to welcome everyone to the 81st District, which you're in right now. So I'd like to thank everyone for being here today and what Penn State does. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Mark Keller. I represent the 86th District, which is all of Perry and part of Cumberland County.
Okay, thank you, everyone. At this time, we're going to have Secretary of DEP, Patrick McDonald, make some opening remarks. Secretary.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for having us here today. As you're aware, we're here to discuss Chesapeake Bay. Move this closer, I'm being told. There we go. Thank you. I'm Patrick McDonald, Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection. Pleasure to be here today on a beautiful day here at Ag Progress Days, and appreciate the hospitality of the representative here in the district. Want to walk through where we are, and we're at the beginning stages, as I think most people know, of developing our Watershed Implementation Plan Phase 3. If you hear people refer to that as WIP throughout the rest of the presentations, it's a lot easier to have that roll off the tongue. As I say, we're at the very beginning stages. A little over a month ago, we actually kicked off the effort in June with a kickoff meeting just outside of Harrisburg, where we had 240 individuals there helping us set an agenda. And I think one of the things that we talk about within this is, as we did Phase 1 and Phase 2, those were developed, frankly, in relatively short order and really done top-down. What we're working to do in our Phase 3 approach is really build a implementation plan from the bottom up. So a lot of engagement, a lot of interaction with the various constituencies that need to be involved as we develop our Bay approach. Those constituencies primarily consist of agriculture and our municipalities. So we have been fully engaged out as much as possible, learning, working with, and engaging with both individual farmers associations as well as municipalities on the approach. Last year, the governor announced a Chesapeake Bay restoration strategy that we are in the midst of implementing. Some of that involved creation of an office focused on these issues within the department. You'll hear a presentation after I'm done from Nikki Casey, who's the director of that office, giving you some more detail about where we stand. We announced between federal and state dollars, $28 million of resources going into Bay projects in agriculture and municipalities. And later this year, part of that money will be focused on ag BMPs in particular, and we've been working very closely with the Department of Agriculture in developing the general approach on that. We've also been working, and I'm sure Secretary Redding will talk more in depth about PA in the Balance, bringing together academia, bringing together all of these partners to figure out what are the best approaches. So there's a lot of work going on within this. In terms of where we stand, and this is the less good news part of all of this. In our midterm assessment, 2017, we were to have achieved 60% of the pollution reduction that we're supposed to achieve by 2025. We are behind in that regard. We have reduced, for example, nitrogen by 11 million pounds. However, between now and 2025, we have an additional 34 million pounds under the limits set under the Bay Agreement to achieve. So we have clearly a lot of work to do, a significant hill to climb. In terms of the Bay itself, we have about 70% or about 80% of the nitrogen reductions to be achieved, and about 70% of that will probably likely have to come from the agricultural sector, just in terms of what the total numbers look like. Now, as we develop our approach, as we develop our plan, we want to be fully engaged with you all, with agriculture, with municipalities in figuring out how far can we get and what do we need to do to take whatever the next steps are. In addition, myself and Secretary Redding have been, on behalf of the governor, actively engaged with our other state partners, Maryland, Virginia, in particular through the Bay Commission, which a number of your colleagues are represented on, as well as within the Bay program itself, through organizations like the Principal Staff Committee to the Bay program. The last thing I'd want to say is we are very, very reliant upon, actually two things I'll say. One, we're very, very reliant upon our federal partners and the dollars that they bring. That is money that goes directly to our conservation districts to support the work that they do. That is money that goes directly to farms. That is money that goes directly to our municipalities to implement these best management practices. So we're very, very appreciative of that partnership and looking forward to continuing that partnership with our federal partners. Last thing I want to mention, because I think it's something that has gotten, over the last year, got significant attention as part of the restoration strategy. One of the components of that was agricultural inspection program that we worked with our conservation districts on. When I came in, one of the things I said was these inspections are designed to get us as good information as we can about what is going on the farms, so that we can bring attention, resources where it's needed. So I'm pleased to say we've, and the commitment and what EPA wanted to see from us was 10% of farms inspected. We've actually, to date, we've inspected 12% of the acreage of farmland within the state, primarily through, again, the good partnership we have with the conservation districts. We found that 60% of the farms have the plans in place that they need. For that other 40%, that's where we're focused on how can we bring resources and assistance and education to those farms so they understand the value add of the various best management practices, not just for the environment, but for many of their operations. And I think notably, the only times we've really looked at enforcement within this is where there was absolute refusal to allow a conservation district even on the farm. So as we've done this, it's been something that I think, one, we said at the beginning, but two, I hope we're demonstrating that we really are entering this with spirit of cooperation. How can we help? And bringing as much knowledge and resources to the effort as possible. I'll stop there so we can maximize time for conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And next on our agenda is Veronica Casey, the program manager from the Chesapeake Bay Program Office at the Department of Environmental Protection, and she has a presentation for us today. So I'd welcome her to come forward and proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. Morning, everyone. What I'm going to try and give you this morning is just an overview of, first, why are we doing this? Why is it important? Second, the progress made, but more importantly, the job that's ahead of us. And the important thing is that we really need your engagement in order to move forward and to make this successful. I'm also going to give you an overview of the midpoint assessment that we're going through with the rest of the Bay Program Partnership people, with the rest of the other states within the Bay Watershed, as far as the overall allocations that we're going to be assigned, the issues that we're trying to address, and the schedule that we're on to complete that assessment, as well as EPA has set a number of expectations, not only Bay-wide, but we're also special in that EPA has established specific expectations just for Pennsylvania, and I'll get into those and the reasons why we're so special. And I'm also going to give you kind of the overview of the schedule that we're under and the game plan for us as far as moving forward with our WIP. So first, why would we want to do this? Yes, there's a TMDL, or a total maximum daily load, that under the Federal Clean Water Act that we're kind of required to comply with. But even if that were to go away, to me, it's more important about our local water quality. It's about the streams in Pennsylvania. We want to clean them up. We're under obligation under our own Pennsylvania Clean Streams Law and under Article 1, Section 27 of the Pennsylvania Constitution. All of our citizens have the right to clean air, pure water. So more important to me, and more important is this, is that this plan is implementable at the local level, that it gets at clean water for all of us, and then that will get us to the direction that we need to go to clean up the Bay. So, all right, here's some demographics for you. Pennsylvania's portion of the Bay watershed. Pennsylvania encompasses 35.2% of the watershed. But more importantly, half of the Bay watershed is in the state of Pennsylvania. I mean, half of the state. The watershed is half of the state. So it's a large part of the state is within the Bay. So we really need to look at this in order to get at our local water quality. If we get at that, half of the state will be addressed. There are 4 watersheds, the largest being the Susquehanna, the second being the Potomac. So sometimes I thought everybody has a basic understanding of the lingo that we all kind of like spit out and etc. But somebody says to me, well, what do you mean by a sector? Because I use these terms all the time. So let's step back. What is a sector? So in the TMDL that EPA established, the pollutant sources were divided into different categories, basically, so that they could be, labeled by different similar operations or processes or practices. So to me, when I say to you wastewater sector, I mean those point sources, those things that are facilities that have a pipe that you can measure the pollutant out of them. They have a permit that we can measure what goes in. We can say, all right, you're allowed to then discharge only this amount, okay? Then we have non-point sources, and they aren't so easy to address, and this is why it's so hard for us to make progress. Because unlike the other states, to a large extent, most of our pollutant sources to the Bay are from non-point sources. So this is basically pollution that comes from rainfall and stormwater. And the 2 biggest ones for us are agriculture. I'm sure you all know what the agriculture sector is, or urban runoff. And that's basically land area that's been developed. It's your cities, it's your towns, it's the streets. So when you're walking down the street of Harrisburg and the runoff coming down the street in the drain, that's what I mean by urban runoff. So when I give you these next pie charts and these next discussion about loadings, then I can tell you what I mean by that sector. And then the last one is forest sector. That's area covered totally by trees. So they kind of, within the TMDL, divided it up into those 4 major sectors. So, okay, Secretary McDonald got into this a little bit. These are based on the old Phase 3 5.3 model. This is part of the midpoint assessment. These numbers might change a little bit, but these are what we're being told that we have to meet. So as he mentioned, we have to reach another 34 million pounds of nitrogen between 2015 and 2025. So when you see the sector, the largest part of it, as you can see, has to come from agriculture, being 78%. Another 20% from urban and 2% from septic, based on where we were going within the Phase 2 WIP. This is kind of the discussion, okay? Same thing with phosphorus. We need to get another 0.7 million pounds between 2015 to 2025. Again, the largest part having to come from agriculture, 76%, another 24% from urban. When you get to sediment, you have similar numbers with 70% from ag, 30% from urban. So within these charts, you can kind of see the relative contribution to the bay from these different sectors and how we can try and address them within the different sectors. All right, so when you look at this in the big picture, the two things that really keep me up nights are bay-wide. Agriculture, Pennsylvania is responsible for 69% of the remaining basin-wide nitrogen load. And of that, agriculture will likely be responsible for more than 80% of that load. So this is what makes me nervous, and it's got me up at night. So how do we put the technical assistance and compliance and structure and the cost share funding in place to deliver those needed reductions? That is our biggest question right now. If we have to come up with that, how do we do it? But more importantly, I want to do that for my local streams, my local water quality, and for our local agricultural community for their benefit. The bay will come. Let's do it for us. So, all right, this gets to my main point here. If you look at our impaired streams, when we do our monitoring and our stream assessments, and we look at, does this stream meet the uses that it was meant to meet? We can look at, there's any number of different uses for that water in that stream that you can designate the stream for. So I looked at relative to the purpose of what we're doing this for, and I looked at aquatic life. So if I look at the aquatic life uses within the Chesapeake Bay portion, the Pennsylvania portion, all those little red lines are streams that are impaired for aquatic life that we want to go after, that we should start to look at. And of that, we have 3,500 miles that are impaired by agriculture uses. We have another 727 miles that the source of that impairment has been identified by urban. And then there's some other total impairment. The total impairment for aquatic life is 3,906 miles. So this kind of gives you an idea when we start to narrow down a way of focusing on where we want to go for local water quality, the total miles of streams impaired for aquatic life within the state of Pennsylvania within the Bay watershed. Then we can start looking at monitoring data as a way of further narrowing down where we might want to go. We've got the Chesapeake Bay watershed is the most monitored watershed. It's got 40 years of monitoring data. There's quite a data set now. There's some really good trend data that we can now use to start looking at where we would want to go and what we might want to do. So we have some good news and we have some not so good news. In some of our monitoring stations, we have some very good improving trends. We're making progress. The water quality is getting better. The nitrogen loads are going down. In some of those stations, it's not so good. It's going up. Or the trend was going down, but now it's leveling off. So we can start using this as a way of making decisions. We start looking at that and start asking questions. We can overlay the impaired streams layer, for example, and start saying, all right, where are our impaired streams? Where is the monitoring data to tell us that we're making progress? Where are we not making progress? But more importantly, where can we make the biggest impact? Just assuming that the trend is improving does not necessarily mean that that's not an area that we need to do more work in. That may be the area that we want to go in order to continue that progress. Or we can go in and say, why is that area degrading? Is it something we're doing in that area that we need to change? Or, is there another different way of doing that? So we can start looking at that data to start saying, okay, do we need to do something different? Do we need to say we need to be here instead of there? So we can start looking and seeing where we want to go. Same for phosphorus, same for sediment. So as Secretary McDonald said, we really didn't meet the progress that we needed to meet. We started this restoration strategy. I'm going to try and go over the 6 elements a little bit with you very briefly. There were 6 as far as getting at 6 priorities. We have a Bay Program Office. We are improving our data record keeping. We need to look at quantifying and multiplying BMPs. So these were the 6 key elements, and I'm going to tell you where we are with some of these in a little more detail than Secretary McDonald did. So, as he mentioned, the big success story for us is our Ag Inspection Initiative. DEP began inspections August 29th of 2016. Conservation District inspections began October 3rd of 2016. So within just the districts and the DEP within this new initiative, within the new inspections that we started, we have now completed 2,080 inspections. Now that doesn't include the inspections that we were already doing under our existing programs. This is just part of the new initiative, and that covers 245,000 acres. So this is a map. We're now starting the 2nd year. The conservation districts revisit every year. All right, do I want to participate? Do I want funding for a district connection to then help DEP to do these inspections? Here is the map, and all the green counties are the ones that have at least applied to DEP to participate for a 2nd year in the program. And the little black numbers are the number of inspections that they're committing to do in order to get that funding. So other things that are a real success for us as part of the restoration strategy is, thank you, Matt and Penn State, for the survey that you did. We did this Penn State survey, and thank all of you that are in the audience or elsewhere that completed this survey. This was a real success for us. We had over 6,700 surveys returned. Here are the results. And the real thing for me is all those BMPs did get reported into the Chesapeake Bay model. We got credit for all those acreages. And it resulted in over 1 million pounds of nitrogen, 79,000 pounds of phosphorus, and 10,000 pounds of sediment. So I'm real excited with those results. The next step is to say, okay, this is now an approved methodology within the Chesapeake Bay program for us to document progress. Next step is how do we learn from that, and how do we continue that initiative to continue to document progress. Another thing is something that NRCS did for us as far as a remote sensing project, a way of using aerial photography and other technology to document BMPs on the ground. That is now another approved methodology for us to use. We can use the lessons learned from that and start seeing, well, okay, in the Susquehanna, how can we use the same methodology to also capture BMP methodology in an effective way? We're also in the process of effectively getting a data management system to document and then report to EPA more effectively the practices that are reported. We did submit in 2016 the data through this new data management system, so it's now more streamlined and more effective. All the conservation districts have practice keeper software, which is a great way for us to now say when they're in the field to document, okay, they're out, they're looking, oh, here's some practices. So now we now have the tools in the hands of the conservation districts to start documenting those practices that we were missing before. I'm also excited we did report or announce another round of urban cost share practices. The second round was announced June 29th. We awarded $2.2 million to 17 municipalities. This was a number of stream restoration and buffer projects. And from that, we should get about 28 pounds of nitrogen, 396 pounds of phosphorus, and 798 pounds of sediment once those municipalities implement those practices. So This is money that comes from EPA, our Chesapeake Bay Implementation Grant. So I'm real excited. This is the second year that we've done this, and it looks like to be a real success. We also last week announced another round of agricultural practices to conservation districts. We announced over $2.9 million to conservation districts for 46 projects. They're going to be things like stream bank fencing, stream bank crossings, barnyard runoff, no-till, cover crops, those kinds of effective practices that get us at reduction. So we're now working with those conservation districts to put the agreements in place so that they can start those practices and start those projects. They have to complete those projects no later than September 30th, 2019. So let's get into the midpoint assessment and the WIP a little bit. There are 4 basic EPA Baywide expectations in the WIP. Big among them is you're going to have programmatic and numeric commitments between 2018 and 2025. So what are we going to do programmatically and numerically to meet that commitment? Most important for me are the strategies that we're going to use to engage local, regional, and federal partners. We also have to account for climate change, Conowingo Dam, and sector growth. And we have to have local planning goals and local targets. So those are the big 4. And we're special. We got our own set of expectations because we didn't meet our progress. We're behind. So EPA being so nice and generous, thank you EPA for those of you in the room from EPA, we have our own set of specific expectations that we must meet, meaning we must have a set of programmatic policy and regulatory changes that we are needed in order to meet and accelerate our progress. We have to demonstrate that we have the resources available to implement it, including a dedicated, targeted state cost share program. Now, the next steps with this are to evaluate what they put into our expectations and see if they make sense for us and go ahead and see how we're going to implement them as defined by EPA, or come up with an alternate strategy that still meets the goal. They did say if we can come up with a better way of doing it and demonstrate that we will meet the same goal, they will consider it. There are some actions identified in the expectation document that they can and will take if we don't do this. I put them up there. As far as I'm concerned, we're going to succeed and we're going to make this. I don't want to even consider those actions. So, midpoint assessment, we're in the process of data collection and analysis. We're looking at Conowingo Dam, climate change, sector growth. In the end, we're going to come up with planning targets by state and by basin. We're going to have to look at equity and cost effectiveness in doing those planning targets. And we're also looking at finalizing the model that's going to try and do all this for us. Here's the schedule. We hope to have, the key one is in October, I'll be able to come out and show you what our draft planning target allocations will be, those numbers that we're going to have to meet. Those revised numbers that say, okay, Pennsylvania, here is your piece of the pie that you must meet. And then we can start saying, okay, how do we realistically meet that number? So we'll start looking at that. Then we're going to have to do by December, we have to submit our Phase 3 WIP to EPA for review. They'll give us comments. Then we have December of 2019 to finalize it. We're in the process of getting stakeholder input. We have a steering committee in place. We have 6 work groups. We have agriculture, urban, forestry, wastewater, funding, and local planning goals. They have met a couple of times. We have a communication strategy that's building off our one-day kickoff conference. We're going to start really building on that over the next couple of months. We need to start looking at sector-specific goals and targets. We also need to look at local area planning goals, priority watersheds. Key to this is go back to local water quality. How do we get at this, and how does it make sense for us to measurable outputs, measurable milestones that achieve what we want, that makes sense to us, that meets that local water quality for us, So here, there was this task force, Bay-wide task force that was created to define what is meant by a local planning goal. And it can be defined any number of ways. So it's not like there's only one way to define a local planning goal. It could be a watershed. It could be a county. It could be a municipality or a couple municipalities together. It could be a watershed. It could be, all right, we all agree this one particular practice really gets a lot for us. It means a lot to us. Therefore, this is one practice we want to put everywhere. Therefore, that is a local goal for us to put this everywhere. So it could be any combination of those things that we could call a local planning goal. So here's our schedule. We've had our steering committee and work groups meeting. We had our kickoff. We're now in the July through October part of working through some issues with the Bay Program Partnership around Conowingo, sector growth, and et cetera. The work group co-chairs have all met. They've all identified their members. Those members are going to start convening within the next month or two. We have the comments compiled from the written and the listening session. Those will be out in public and posted soon. We're going to start working through that between October and May. We will be writing that whip with a lot of public input and solicitation in a number of different ways. I hope all of you get involved in one way or another in writing that whip and providing input. And then we'll do a formal public comment period in August and September with the goal of submitting it to EPA by December. In the public comment after the listening session, we did do a written comment period. We asked for input around these 5 questions. We are summarizing that input. We have it. We will be posting that soon so you can all see the comment that we got. If any of you have this, you can still give us answer to these questions. I'm still interested in what you have to say. And again, like Secretary McDonald said, we had 240 people at that listening session. We have their draft. There's a demographic here. We got input from individuals. We got it from conservation districts. We got it from state, local, and federal government. We got it from environmental groups, nonprofits. We're looking for consultants, engineering firms. It was a wide, broad group of people that have already provided input, and we're going through that now. Here are some other resources that you can look for further information concerning the Chesapeake Bay, should you be interested. And that is my information. The one thing that I want to highlight for you is our new Phase 3 WIP website. There's a link that'll directly take you to that webpage. We'll be adding stuff to that as we develop it. Minutes from the steering committee meeting, summaries, drafts of reports. So make that one of your favorites to follow how we do this. And with that, I'm going to shut up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. This time we're going to have Secretary Redding give us some remarks, and for the members, we'll ask questions after Secretary Redding's done of these first 3. So, Secretary.
Very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Welcome to Ag Progress Days, and a note of thanks to Dean Roush and his team for hosting us as well. It is always good to be with you, and particularly on this topic of the Chesapeake Bay and the WIP 3. I mean, as I look around, every one of us have been in conversations about what to do, I mean, what's expected of us, what has been done, and very much appreciate the partnership that we have with the committees and your interest in and concern for how we do what is expected of us as a Commonwealth, and certainly within the sector of agriculture. So thank you for being here and being really in this conversation in a way, because it's key, as Nikki has laid out. I mean, while we have a strategy and we've got a plan, the input to that plan, the execution of that plan is going to require a lot of thought. It's going to require a lot of money, and certainly a lot of engagement, both with you and the General Assembly, but also our stakeholders across the state. So thank you for being part of it. I will say that we are entering this new phase in the WIP 3 with some momentum, though. Having been around the WIP 1 and aware of the WIP 2, sort of come back into this WIP 3, and I think we had the valuable lessons of what worked in the first 2 WIPs. And as with everything, lessons learned are critical. And we've tried to pull those certainly into this conversation. We have, I think, some clearer expectations from the EPA for the state that maybe wasn't there before and now has come back and to use Nikki's terms, even some special status concerns. And those things are pieces we've got to factor in. But I think we also have this partnership between the agencies, and between Agriculture, DCNR, and DEP, and having Secretary Dunn and Secretary McDonald as part of these conversations, because it's in recognition that as you look at the pie chart that was on the screen a few minutes ago, there are multiple sectors in the conversation. I do feel the heat on the pie chart, right, in terms of agriculture and what's there. But we are not alone. I mean, there's still the other sectors, and I think part of the answer for us, quite frankly, is found in how we treat the other sectors within the pie chart, right? And we can talk more about that. But we enter this phase, I think, with 2 other really critical pieces of information. One, the work that Matt Royer and Dean Roush and the whole Penn State team have done with the PA and the balance. And I'll reserve those, let Matt, as the lead on that, talk about it. But just to say that really gave us a head start in both the agricultural area specifically, but also for the WIP 3 as well, because there's pieces of that I think build on the work of the last couple of years. And remember that part of the effort was to get a good farm level survey, and we've talked about that for many, many years, and we finally have confirmation, quite frankly, of what we've been saying that agriculture's been doing, but we finally have confirmation. Again, credit to Penn State and the dean and the extension educators across the state to go out and do the survey, do the validation, give us the numbers, so when Nikki talks about those components being included in the model, it's there with some confidence. That is not what we had previously for the WIP 1 or 2. Secondly, I think Secretary McDonald mentioned, and Nikki as well, the on-farm inspections that have been done by the conservation districts and DEP. And we were speculating a year ago to now be at a moment where we have that insight across the state is further confirmation of both the good work that's being done, but also it helps in our efforts to sort of then say, where do you put your limited dollars and the human capital needs that you have, which are also limited to work. And that will help us, I think, a lot in getting out of this macro conversation about the entire watershed and 41 counties and all of these farms down to where we really need to be focused to get the results that will change the water quality. Right? So if you think of these things as really set up in a way that allows us to have an intelligent conversation then about what is a plan for Pennsylvania, how do you execute that plan? But I think importantly we've got to bring a lot of stakeholders with us that we're doing the right things. And we can now say that with some confidence that we know the water quality is improving. That's both by the science, but it's also by farm level plan, and the individual farmer feedback by way of survey or on the farm survey by our conservation district partners. So I put that out as part of this discussion about what we've got to do and importantly, how do we do it? And would ask that as we get into these conversations, clearly there are components of that we can talk further about. Final point would be that several weeks ago I had the privilege of being with the Chesapeake Bay Commission briefing the Watershed congressional delegation, and was struck by some comments that Professor Walter Boynton with the University of Maryland Chesapeake Biological Lab shared. And it was that further confirmation, and he said a lot of different things that confirmed this, but number one, that the dissolved nutrient concentration was decreasing in the watershed. The water clarity was improving. The number of acres of seagrasses in the Chesapeake Bay are 3 times what they were in 1980. 100,000 acres of seagrasses. Key indicators that what we're doing upstream and in the watershed wide is making a difference. And that is, I think, gives us confidence as we go into this that others are watching and certainly the water is responding. So thank you again. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you both for your comments. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so we thought we would turn to questions from the members for you two gentlemen, and as well as Veronica, before we turn to the panel discussion. So if members do have questions, we would entertain them at this point. I guess I'll start out. I appreciate the information that's been presented so far, and when you think about 70% going forward having to come from the agriculture sector, that's pretty concerning. And my focus has always been to make sure that our farmers get the credit for the good work that they're doing on their farms, because I strongly believe that farmers are the ultimate good stewards of the land, and so I think that credit is very important. I'm interested in and I think that you've touched on this, Secretary Redding. I'm interested in the attitude of the EPA in dealing with both of your agencies in going forward. Is there truly an environment where they want to work with us? Are they going to come forward with significant federal funding to help us implement these best management practices that that have been identified? Because obviously, when you're looking at 70% coming from agriculture, that could be a huge burden, and funding could be an important component.
It's absolutely one of the critical components here, and one of the missing links. The couple things I think I'd say are, one, just as starting point, I think it's important and notable that EPA did give us the credit for the survey work. Frankly, I think a lot of the work that we have tried to do as a state over the last year is tell our story. I think the other, frankly, Maryland and Virginia in many ways viewed us in the same way they viewed themselves in terms of what they were up against and what we were up against. And just seeing the look on people's faces in a room at a Bay Commission meeting or at a Bay program meeting when you say, just the county of Lancaster has twice as many dairy cows as the entire state of Maryland has. It's significant in terms of the approach, both what is different about our state and what that means for the approach we need to take. I think I'll defer to the Secretary on the funding piece, because so much of it comes from NRCS. But I will say, obviously, we've seen budget proposals that include significant cuts on both the EPA and Department of Agricultural side. I've seen Congress, has in most cases pushed back pretty heavily against that. Defunding of the Bay program itself was on the table. A lot of that money's been restored in some of the more recent proposals. So I think it's an open question as to what resources and how. And I also think the other missing link in this for us as a state historically has been we've taken that money and kind of put it everywhere. One of the things we're trying to do both through the model and through some of our own data, as you saw in that impairment map, is be more focused in, if we have a dollar, where is the best place to spend that, both to improve our own water quality, but ultimately to have an impact on that TMDL. So.
Yeah, it's a great question, right? Because I think, part of our collective challenge is sort of the story we tell about the work of agriculture and conservation, but certainly our own sort of attitudes and opinions about how we approach the task and express that to our various stakeholders is also important. What I've seen, this is just from the department standpoint, I think there, in recent months with the WIP 3 conversation, it has been sort of a push and push back a little bit. When you look at these expectation memos, and I think for both Pat and I particularly, you read some of that and, listen, we've got a task. It's big enough without taking into consideration some of the other, global perspectives around climate change as one example, right? If we focus in on the 70% that comes from agriculture, that in and of itself will consume us. So staying focused on what is really important in there, I think, is important. But the exchange has been productive, been constructive. I think the work of demonstrating our commitment by farm-level verification has gone as far further than anything, because it gets out sort of, we as an industry claiming we're doing more than we're getting credit for. We actually have farm-level confirmation by very credible third parties. And that has also helped to change the view of what Pennsylvania is doing. Final point, I think there is still some gap between the Chesapeake Bay, EPA Chesapeake Bay program funding and the dollars from Congress for the Chesapeake Bay specific, and the relationship to the U.S. Department of Agriculture Farm Bill funded conservation programs. You know, the reality is in Pennsylvania is that our progress has been made on the land as a result of what we collectively have articulated as the needs of conservation within the Farm Bill, not as a benefit to the Bay. It's a beneficiary, but we've done it for good conservation practices as a part of our agricultural program, right? There's a little bit of a gap in that acknowledgement by the EPA that the USDA is a significant contributor, my opinion. And I think going forward is we have to then articulate that even further within the next Farm Bill of what we need in Pennsylvania for Pennsylvania to reach the goal of the nitrogen and phosphorus reduction. And that will be both a conversation for us with our PA delegation, but it's also getting our friends in the watershed, particularly in the agricultural community, to appreciate that if you're going to apportion 80% of the nitrogen load reduction to achieve the Bay TMDL, that's going to take some apportionment of the federal Farm Bill conservation funding in a different formula and a different way than it's been to date, right? So on one hand, we can't say, listen, I've got responsibility for 80% of it, and then turn around and get 20% of the funding. And that's going to be a message to both our congressional delegation and to the USDA, EPA as well, is that there has to be some reconciliation of the allotment of dollars to task. And that's a conversation that we have not entered before. And we're going to have to confront the question with this WIP 3, how do you fund the work, both in technical assistance as well as the actual on-farm practices. Some will come from the state, we'll continue to invest, but to date, the majority of that has come via the Farm Bill funding. Well-timed in our conversation because we're in those discussions for the 2018 Farm Bill. And of course, Congressman Thompson and Congressman Evans will hear more about that today. This will be part of that conversation. So thank you.
Very much. I appreciate that information. I guess we need that recognition that Pennsylvania is different from some other states, and we can't cripple our agriculture industry in the state. So we're looking for reasonableness, and we need that cooperation from the feds and that reasonableness to enable us to move forward. So thank you. Thank you very much. Chairman Vogel.
Thank you. I'm not sure who to address this question to, but we talk a lot about, those of us that are sort of kind of in the know about the Conowingo Dam. A lot of people here probably don't have ever heard of it or know what the situation is. Could one of you just take a couple minutes and explain what the deal is with that and the impact it has on us and the impact it's going to have to clean it up, I guess, or whatever we need to do with it?
Certainly. So when we talk about the Bay, we're talking about generally needing to manage nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. One of the things that was factored into the initial modeling was the Conowingo Dam. Actually, the entire dam structure moving up the Susquehanna, but the Conowingo is kind of the last stop just over the border in Maryland. And when they initially did that modeling, the sense was that that dam would achieve what they call equilibrium sometime after 2030. That means that you put a dam in a river, as sediment flows down that river, it's going to settle and settle behind the dam. It's reaching that equilibrium now. So what we're already seeing is sediment flows over that dam where it was sort of acting as a BMP built into the modeling, it's no longer functioning in that way. So there's a conversation going on really in a couple of fronts as to what that means. Like, one, what is the actual impact of that in terms of the bay itself? And then two, how do you approach it? So I know Maryland last week announced a pilot that they're going to be doing with some limited dredging of some of that sediment behind the dam. But it's something that, as as Nikki Casey said, as we deal with this midterm assessment, it will be one of the things factored in, and it becomes both a one, how does it impact the overall number? But then two, how does that get apportioned? Is it something we deal with pre-2025 or not? You know, all of those, I think, are open questions for the program to wrestle with.
Chairman Paszynski.
Thank you very much. And thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony and all your good work. I wonder if you could clarify regarding the inspections. You indicated that you inspected 12% rather than the 10% that was the goal. And I was wondering if you could give us a hard number on what that 12% would be.
Certainly. So we inspected what we were looking to do. We actually originally characterized this in terms of total number of farms. So we have approximately 33,600 farms. There's a 10% expectation that would be over 3,300 farms a year. We inspected 2,800, and important, I think, you know, Nikki put up the 2,000 number. That this includes both those as well as those Act 38 inspections that we conduct. And the total acreage was 393,426, which is, as I say, about the 12%.
Okay. So I was wondering if you could give us an idea of the turnaround time from the actual inspection on the farm itself through your review, the report, and then the final analysis that comes out. What's that turnaround time? What kind of manpower do you need?
Sure.
I'm leading to the question is, do you have enough manpower to be able to try to reach your goal?
Well, I think it's a couple things. One, and Nikki, you might want to jump in on this in terms of some of the answer, but I think one, it's for those DEP inspections, we have our own processes and operations to report that information through our systems. With the counties, it's really twofold. One, we get quarterly reports from the county conservation districts on how their program is working. So we get that, compile it, and then reflect it back out. But two, now with rolling out Practice Keeper, we're going to have, I think, some better real-time information as well, since we've rolled that out in July. So some of those timeframes are going to be better. Obviously, you know, the more resources we have, both on the inspection side, but probably more importantly on the technical assistance, education, all of those things that need to follow once we have the information, more resources mean better outcome.
Because essentially the reason I'm asking the question, at 3,000 inspections out of 33,000, basically we're looking at a 10-year turnaround time. We're trying to set the goals and provide the necessary funds to address it. And it's rewarding that you're getting a 60% compliance rating out of those 12%, those 3,000 farms. So I was wondering how we could increase that inspection rate, so then that way there you might be able to identify areas that need to be addressed a little bit more carefully.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the interesting dynamics on the inspection is, as Nikki pointed out, most of the counties are participating in the program. There are a few that are not. I know one of those counties in a presentation that they gave to the conservation districts a few months ago pointed out, even with not being involved in the program, they're seeing more farmers coming in for technical assistance. So just the fact that I think there's renewed attention across the board on the importance of planning, the importance of BMPs, and interest throughout every level of this in terms of how do we address these issues.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your continued good work.
Thank you.
Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, Vicki, for your testimony. I'm gonna go askew here just for a moment. One of the things that was touched on, which is, I think, a huge part of what we're talking about, is the MS4 program. And I'll just be perfectly blunt with you. I think it was one of the most poorly rolled out implementations that I've ever seen come out of the EPA yet, and coming to a township and to a farm near you very soon. And it's okay to talk about, BMPs, which are great, and most of that is done with agriculture cooperation. But when the EPA says, we're going to hand this down to the local level, and there's no set methodology in which you must use to reach your reduction, it's now up to you at the local level to figure out how to do it, be at the mercy of an environmental engineer at the local level, and we really don't care what it costs. So that's the part of the topic with funding that nobody's really talking about. The only reason I know about it is my own township is now, and I live very rural in Adams County, my township is now over $400,000 per year to try to implement something where they don't even have a realization of how to acquire or achieve the goals which are set forth. And some of the people that it affects the most, and because my township decided we're going to go by area of impervious surface. Well, who in a rural community has more areas of impervious surface than farmers? We've got our barns, our storage buildings, our sheds, our tractor sheds, you name it. We've got a lot of impervious surface. And when you're basing a budget off of percentage of impervious surface, a lot of that cost comes right down to our agriculture community. Now, as we all know, every farmer in Pennsylvania is extraordinarily wealthy, correct? Isn't that what we determine? They all make millions of dollars every year, and this should be of no consequence to us. But unfortunately, when we do have bad years, and not all farmers are swimming in money, this falls right on their back. And I have been screaming. My screams go a little bit unheard to the EPA, but we have got to figure out how to remove this from the local level and being at the mercy of an environmental engineer that might be engineering something that's way overkill, might not be doing enough, but how do you expect the people sitting behind those tables at the township supervisors meetings to have any clue one bit whatsoever as to what their engineer that they hired to get them through this MS4 program is he leading them in the right direction or is he not? And there's no way they could know. I doubt very much there's a person on this panel that could know what he's doing is right or wrong, but yet the costs are all laying right at the local level, and some of the people that are bearing the biggest burden are our farmers. And we're begging for DEP to step into the federal government and say, wait a minute, at least get something that is formatted so that this doesn't happen. Is there anything that any of you can add to this discussion? I guess you'd want to say, how much is enough to try and squeeze out of our agriculture community to implement whatever it is they want implemented?
Sure. No, thank you for that. The couple things. One, just so, and I imagine most people are aware, but for our urbanized stormwater, which isn't always urban, as you point out, in the traditional sense, we have a general permit that was put out that our notices are due actually next month. And we've had a general permit for a number of years that had minimum controls within it. The difference this year is a requirement that to demonstrate that over a 5-year period, you're going to reduce, in particular, sediment by 10%. And there's nitrogen and phosphorus benefit that we also get, 5 and 3% respectively there. The couple of things I think I'd say and would welcome further discussion is, one, I know we at the department have both in terms of trying to be out educating through, whether it's webinars, being at association meetings, et cetera, trying to educate folks as to what these requirements are over the last year and a half. We also have staff, I know one of our staff in particular has been attending township meetings that folks have requested to try to help through exactly some of those issues to make sure you're exactly on those paths. On the cost piece, I mean, one, caveat at the beginning to say drop in the bucket in terms of some of the stormwater money that we have been able to put out, but there are some resources available there for some of our municipalities. But two, the other thing we've tried to encourage, and we have very good examples of this in Chester, in York, in Wyoming Valley area, is municipalities working together to resolve this. Because the most cost-effective solutions on stormwater may not be within your borders if you're working regionally. So one of the things we've tried to encourage through this program is multi-municipal cooperation, so that working together you can identify where those most effective BMPs might be located. And as I say, it might be upstream or downstream of you in terms of where those get installed.
I guess I want to just follow it up, and I know
Sure.
there's a lot of other people that want to ask questions here, but why would we put it on, let's just say we have 5,000 different municipalities that are going to be, either are or going to be affected by the MS4 program. Why do we want 5,000 different engineering ideas as to how to reach these goals? Why wouldn't we have some area-wide? Because to tell you the truth, there's no township or borough that touches mine that's right now called into it, but there will be in the future. But in the meantime, I've got an 80-year-old man standing in or close to 90-year-old man standing in a township meeting holding up his 3 bills from this month's medical expenses, his pharmaceutical, saying, which one of these months do you want me to go without my medicine so I can pay this?
No, and I think, to your point, one, I think there are areas where there can be cooperation. I will say a lot of the municipalities have very different infrastructure in terms of what's been installed over time, very different geology, very different topography in terms of where these impacts are, what they are, amount of impervious surface. As I said, anything from pretty heavily urbanized areas like you have, Lancaster's done a lot of work on the green infrastructure side, to very rural areas. So it's also, it's an area where I think municipalities, and the department can play a role in helping educate, inform what the various approaches are, but there's also a lot of differences municipality to municipality in terms of both what the impacts are and what those solutions might be.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Determined to stay on schedule, but we're going to take one more question by Representative Sid Kavulich. But before that, I want to point out that we've been joined by Representative Tobash, Representative Newman, and Senator Street. So I welcome them. And Representative Bloom. Representative Kavulich.
Thank you,
the floor is
Mr.
yours.
Chairman. Most of my questions were in relation to the chairman's and Representative Maul's, but my concern is that the biggest complaint I hear from my municipalities is unfunded mandates. And my biggest concern is that this turns into another unfunded mandate, not only in our communities, but also our municipalities, but our agricultural communities too. And so since they asked most of my questions, let me try to change streams here. Now, you said that, you mentioned Congressman Thompson and Evans. And I'm sure there have been maybe no official conversations with them, but I would think that there have been some conversations with them. Is there a feeling that that the importance of this on Pennsylvania and the agriculture community, how important it is to that community, and that we get adequate funding to take care of these, of what is going to happen in the next 10 years?
Sure. I'll start, and I'm sure Secretary Redding has something to say about that. I'll say this has been a big topic of discussion, in particular through the Bay Commission. As the Secretary said, the Bay Commission organized an effort to go down and really, for each of the states, engage with the congressional delegations around what the needs are and what that might mean for funding. I think, you know, it's parallel tracks in that we're still, as I started out at the beginning of this, we're at the beginning of the Watershed Implementation Plan Phase 3. So what all of these solutions look like, and one of the things I stress with both our staff and then as I talk to the other stakeholders is looking for ways that we can reduce transaction costs as we do this work, looking to how we reduce our own transaction costs, looking at how we reduce the implementer's transaction cost, how do we both find more resources but take best advantage of them, and that's been an ongoing discussion. So.
Representative, specifically, yes, we have had conversations. They have asked an appropriate question of what does that mean in terms of dollars, and what types of programs and investments would you need? Is that tax credit? Is it really on the EQIP program for manure handling systems? Is it on conservation planning? So I think that conversation is still an open question, but we're trying to quantify what that looks like for Pennsylvania. To Secretary McDonald's point, I mean, there have been a lot of conversations at the commission level. I mean, the commission understands as well the TMDL and what it means to the watershed. So they're looking at it at a commission-wide basis. And those conversations will continue, and that'll be both for EPA funding, but also USDA and the conservation funding, maybe National Fish and Wildlife and other sources. There's still a gap in there, though, of state need, right? Because if you come back to the requirements under the Clean Streams Law, I mean, our foundational conservation and nutrient management work is found in state law, not in federal law. So we have to sort of confront the question if that's a requirement that we have under state law, is that we have to then say, what does it mean in terms of state dollars to address the needs of state law? And we'll have to talk about that. And that's been, the governor's proposed in this past budget, not in the final budget, but some additional dollars, $45 million, to sort of take us in that direction to address both the needs of DEP, DCNR, and Ag. But I think that conversation for us needs to continue, because at the end of the day, the base requirements we have for meeting and even what we're looking at through the farm inspections are things that the state requires: nutrient management, Ag E&S, et cetera. So we'll have to talk about what that looks like for Pennsylvania, but there is a gap in there.
Mm-hmm. And just a statement, for what it's worth, in my opinion, when we talk about the requirements that we have to meet, of equal importance is the fact that we don't want to cause a great burden or a crippling burden on our agriculture community. So I think those two conversations should go hand in hand, or both of utmost importance.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There are co-equal goals in this. There are viable farms and clean water. You won't get the second without the first one. There's no way to do it. Right? When you look at the magnitude, the 80% reductions, I mean, they're not going to come out of municipal systems. It's going to have to come off of the land and the land base, and that's going to be agriculture. So sensitivity to that, but also our focus intently on how then do you get to the practices on those farms that get you the 80%, right? And that's really the key conversation for us. But thank you.
Thank you.
The questions, but now we're going to call up our panel, and our panel discussion will include Secretary Redding, Secretary McDonald, Veronica Casey, John Bell, Senior Counsel with the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, Chris Herr, the Executive Vice President of Penn Ag Industries, Brenda Shambaugh, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Association of Conservation Districts, Morrill King, Pennsylvania Director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and Matthew Royer, Director, Agriculture and Environment Center, Penn State College of Agricultural Sciences. We have quite an esteemed panel here. Each panelist is given 2 minutes, which I know is a short time frame. 2 minutes for comments, and then we're going back to questions. So I guess we'll start with John Bell.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to offer some comments today. I'm John Bell. I am Senior Government Affairs Counsel for Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, and Pennsylvania Farm Bureau is a statewide general farm organization with a farm and rural family membership of more than 62,000. I think the at least objective of my testimony today, and I have given you a prepared statement, and I certainly don't have time to read that. I would ask that it be treated as part of the record. But I hope to give you in my testimony and my remarks some perspective, at least from Farm Bureau's standpoint, of maybe where we were, where we are, and where we hope to be, including the goods and the challenges to do that. 7 years ago, almost to the day, and I think in this very building, I offered testimony on behalf of Pennsylvania Farm Bureau that provided you a laundry list of criticisms that we had of the Environmental Protection Agency relative to their demands and administration and lack of help to Pennsylvania relative to what then was Pennsylvania's development of its first watershed implementation plan. And that laundry list included, frankly, unreasonable timeframes and reduction mandates, a Chesapeake Bay model which did little education in how it worked and how people can use it. The failure, the constant threat of penalties and sanctions, and the failure to provide relative tools, technical tools, to help farmers and local communities. And if I dare to summarize WIP 1 and 2, and I do know the risk of doing that, it seemed to be a reflection of unreasonable demands and very subjective guarantees that Pennsylvania made to those demands. There was really not a specific plan of action, how, who, where, how much, and how to finance what we were all intending to do to reach TMDL reduction goals. I think at this point, excuse me, I would at least recognize that there has been relative progress in, I think, the relationship between Pennsylvania and EPA on these matters. We don't hear quite the rhetoric that we heard from EPA officials back in 2010. There seems to be a recognition of the uniqueness in challenge that Pennsylvania faces. And as a result, we think there's going to be a better effort to provide the type of technical tools and technical assistance that Pennsylvania needs, frankly. And I'd mention the Chesapeake Assessment Scenario Tool, or CAS tool, that most recently rolled out and was developed. That's a much more user-friendly tool than previous tools, not only to help farmers and local governments and local planners make some reasoned decisions and analyze those decisions, not only in terms of environmental improvement, but also costs. That tool can do so in a much quicker time frame. It was also mentioned recently that EPA has committed, and it was mentioned at the steering committee meeting, that EPA has definitively committed personnel and time, some 17 personnel, technical personnel, that will be available and readily available, as opposed to back in 2010 and 2011 to help us reach our goals. And make no mistake about it, 2025 is still the deadline, but we're hearing words from EPA officials that at least give me some optimism that they understand the challenge, the practical challenge, and maybe a little bit flexible in recognizing in that deadline frame how we do it. But make no mistake, we have still serious challenges. And I'll mention the last two. The first two that I mentioned in my testimony are just trying to get local communities politically, socially to work together and to try to work with these tools. There's a lot of human element involved, and that just takes time and patience. But the last two are funding, available funding, and frankly, the economic situation that many farmers face. We still have a very serious gap between the amount of available public funding, and this was evidenced by the 2014 estimates that Penn State made, which said we need at least $240 million to put in place the infrastructure to get us to meet 2025, and we need some $378 million a year to not only put in place, but keep in place that infrastructure and improvement. But yet, it was estimated that about $146 million in state and federal monies were available. And I'm not aware of any material program that will provide the type of monies, state or federal, that will really bridge that gap. Relative to the economic condition that farmers face today, I've included in my testimony an appendix that we prepared in preparation for an upcoming Milk Marketing Board meeting. And it shows, on average, what a Pennsylvania dairy farmer who is a client of Pennsylvania Farm Bureau MSC's business service analysis would make or not make during the last 8 or so years. And the bottom line on that table is marked yearly margin, and that's the net margin per year that the MSC client dairy farm made on average. And the last two figures on the bottom right show a rolling net margin figure throughout the entire 8-year period. The last 2 years are specifically, frankly, sobering in the lack of income, and especially the additional income that farmers would need to meet the additional costs on their own to reach 2025 goals. Pennsylvania MSC client farms, on average, lost $92,000 during 2014 and 2016. So you roll that through an 8-year period, the net income per year for those client farms was about $4,800 a year. We can't ignore that in the collective effort to eventually reach goals. And I think we need to look at this thing with a sense of optimism, but a sense of reality and a little bit of human empathy. And with that, I hope I've given you a good historical perspective, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Good morning. Is this one on? Okay, good morning, everybody. No needs for introductions here. I'll get right to it. The Penn Ag definition of insanity is repeating the same action, expecting a different result. I think that's what we can't afford to do with the WIP 3 program. Today I'd like to discuss and focus my comments on two areas. The first being some perspective on what needs addressed and acknowledged in WIP, And secondly, offer suggestions for public-private partnerships to accomplish the deliverables in WIP 3. As we begin the discussion on WIP 3, there must be some assumptions for each sector to which everybody agrees. So for agriculture, I would ask that we all agree that agriculture is vital to the economy of the Commonwealth, and that we agree that we want Pennsylvania agriculture to continue to grow and expand, offering the residents of Pennsylvania and the world a variety of safe, nutritious food options, while also being good stewards of the land, air, water for future generations, and allowing meaningful careers and economic stimulus to those in agriculture. I think we all can agree on that. Directly, what can be accomplished with a public-private partnership for WIP 3? One, there's a poultry study being conducted by Dr. Paul Patterson here at Penn State. Dr. Patterson's done an amazing job. It's being finalized. This will show the actual poultry numbers for Pennsylvania and where the manure goes and the actual volume of manure produced. This is real data for Pennsylvania, and we need to incorporate it. The second, address, as mentioned earlier, the Conewango sediment issue, no doubt. Third, get manure transport data correct. This could be a joint solution between the Soil Conservation Commission and agriculture. The data is there. It's going nowhere, though. And the need to enhance tracking, reporting of nutrient management plans. By accomplishing this, there is no need to have cap and trade on CAFOs. Also would like to those involved in WIP 3 to be mindful and don't change the standards because the process has not been implemented. So in closing, I would stress that we need WIP 3 to be three things: equitable, realistic, and achievable. There needs to be a public-private partnership, get engaged with stakeholders who can ensure delivery and execution of the plan, and finally, consider possibly an extension of the timeline that we need. So appreciate the opportunity to be here on behalf of Penn Ag, and look forward to working with you as always before. Thank you.
Good morning to all of you. You all know that I'm Brenda Shambaugh, Executive Director for PACD. It's great to see all of you again. Really appreciate it. For those of you who are not as familiar with the conservation districts, there's 66 of them across the state of Pennsylvania. They're all led by a local board who set their own priorities. Clearly, the districts that are within the Chesapeake Bay watershed have set a very high priority for cleaning the natural resources and preserving and protecting water within the bay. And also, more importantly, local water streams and waterways. The districts work not only with the agricultural community, but a lot of other urban interests. We heard talk about MS4s, and they work very closely with their local municipalities as well. So you heard quite a bit about the conservation districts this morning, and you know that they've conducted farm inspections to determine whether or not those farms had manure management plans and ENS plans, erosion and sedimentation control plans. But as far as the districts are concerned, it didn't stop there. Most of the districts did participate in the inspection program. You heard someone say that there are a few that did not. But it didn't matter whether or not they were participating in the program or they were not participating in the program. The districts took it one step further. If the farm did not have one of those two plans, the district helped them develop and implement those plans. And that's a key, because that means that the bottom line was there are more nutrient management plans and ENS plans in Pennsylvania than there were prior to a year and a half ago. And that means a significant workload increase for the conservation districts to help those farmers get those plans, and whether or not they received any funding for that. So the workload increased, and the bottom line is more plans are here today than they were a year and a half ago. The districts, and I think Nikki might have said that, determined that over about the last year and a half, there were about half the farmers who had either a manure management plan or an ENS plan. But significant also is that the districts found that even though the plan wasn't necessarily on paper, they were actually BMPs, or best management practices that were already on the ground. And that's another significant difference than what we've heard maybe prior to a year and a half ago, that the BMPs in many cases were there, it's just that things weren't on paper. That's significant to know. John talked a few minutes about the expense of putting BMPs on the ground and the fact that it takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of effort, and districts have been helping to design those plans. So I wanted to thank you at this point for providing the funding necessary for the conservation districts, both within the DEP budget and the Department of Agriculture budget, to keep those line items for the districts in place and to keep them constant so that the districts have the funding to do that. But John mentioned the funding to put the actual BMPs on the ground. And at this point, I don't know that we've addressed that adequately enough. We've been grappling with the financial reality for a very long time. And I'd like to pose something to the committees to consider. Some kind of a dedicated funding, not only for the Chesapeake Bay, but for water quality in Pennsylvania. And whether that be through a Growing Greener 3 initiative where there's dedicated funding for the Bay, or whether that be through a water resource for major water withdrawals, and again, have dedicated funding out of that go toward the Chesapeake Bay, in addition to significant environmental programs. I think that's something that perhaps we should consider in the future. So, in order to be successful, conservation is a vital tool for a viable agricultural industry. Agricultural operations need a strong safety net. They need vigorous marketing opportunities, and they need a supportive farm policy. Funding for technical assistance and conservation planning is truly a critical tool in the first step of evaluating producers' resource needs. So conservation districts, along with their longstanding state and federal partners, really are helping the agricultural community, the agricultural producers plan and apply for conservation practices on the ground, and then obviously the results of that could be incorporated into the WIP 3 to show nutrient reductions across the watershed. With that, thank you again. Appreciate being here.
Guess I'm next. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. The Chesapeake Bay Commission is a tri-state legislative commission. We represent the General Assemblies of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. We are unique among the Bay Program entities in that we are the only signatory to the history of the Bay Agreements that represents the legislative branch of government. So our chair this year of the full commission, not just the Pennsylvania delegation, is Representative Garth Everett, your colleague from Lycoming County. The rest of the delegation includes Senator Yaw, Senator Alloway, Representative Gillespie, Representative Sturla, Secretary McDonald on behalf of the governor, and Warren Elliott is our citizen member. He's from Franklin County. So we look at public policy, legislation, budgets related to Chesapeake Bay generally across the 3 states. And here in Pennsylvania, our focus right now, as you've heard from a lot of the other folks at the table today, is how are we going to pay for this? We can do a lot better job of spending the money that we do have more cost effectively, targeting certain practices that are cost effective, certain geographies that are cost effective, and we know that targeting works. We've seen that through Farm Bill programs like the Bay Watershed Initiative. We're working with Department of Agriculture in the lead and many other state agencies and private partners on a NIFWIF grant in Lancaster County, looking at targeting one specific watershed to go all out on conservation to see what we can get by using a really focused project. There are ways to make our programs generally more efficient. To Representative Mao's point, how can we encourage multi-municipal planning, looking across these water programs generally. So we're not just looking at stormwater in a silo and drinking water in a silo and floodplain management, but we're looking at this concept that's being touted as one water. It's one water, one resource, right? That's all related. So how can we better integrate the planning and the management of this one water resource? There are things we can do along the lines of public-private partnerships that were mentioned, going out to the private sector, looking for new and creative ideas for new practices and technologies that we're going to need to get all of these reductions. Because we look at those pie charts and they are very intimidating and the goals are very ambitious. So how can we get those new technologies and innovative practices and programs on the ground that we're going to need? But all of these are just cost reduction strategies. They don't eliminate the cost of what we need to do. And we know that we don't entirely have the resources. If we had all the resources in place, it would be done by now, but we don't. We've done 11 million pounds of reductions since 1985. We have 34 million to go. So there is a matter of scale and acceleration in what we need to do. The study that John mentioned, the $378 million, has been estimated for what we needed in the phase 2 WIP. That same study looked at if you targeted the most cost-effective areas and practices, you could significantly reduce that number. But that study was, economic, perfect world, only looking at the bay reductions. As Nikki pointed out in her presentation, we have a lot of local water quality issues. So as the only one up here with Chesapeake Bay somewhere in their title, I'm going to be the one to say it's not just about the bay. It's not about the bay entirely. It's about local water quality. In the handout I've provided, you'll see the entire state and where all the locally impaired watersheds are across the entire state. This is a statewide issue, a statewide problem. And let's look at this current opportunity with the phase 3 WIP for Chesapeake Bay. This is really an opportunity for us to take a comprehensive strategic look at how we're funding clean water statewide, how we can do a better job of providing more resources and utilizing them in a more cost-effective and targeted ways. And I also want to echo Brenda's point that it's not just about the practice cost itself, but there's an enormous amount of technical assistance that has to occur to get that practice not only on the ground, but designed in a way that's going to work for a particular farm and location and maintained into the future, and finding the right mix, again, because it's not just some mathematical equation of what practices are going to go on the ground, but it's what's the right mix of practices for a particular farm, for a particular municipality, for a particular location, and that requires good technical assistance and humans in conversation and interacting, making those decisions. So, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to provide some remarks. My name is Matt Royer, and I'm the director of the Agriculture and Environment Center at Penn State within our College of Ag Sciences, and we're very happy to host you all here this morning for this meeting, and want to provide a few remarks now to round up the panel remarks. This is a really, really hard issue to grapple with. It's probably one of the major environmental issues globally that we're dealing with as high priority, and that's water quality impacts of our coastal areas, local streams, related to non-point source pollution, which is essentially runoff off of our landscapes. And so really, we've done a good job in the last 30 years of addressing point sources. There's technology, built into the Clean Water Act to address that, and permitting schemes. This is the hard task, and because really it's based on how we live our lives, how we utilize our land and manage our land. We're all kind of contributing to this issue, and so we all really need to be a solution to the issue and to the problem. And I think that's a real opportunity in a way, and it's an opportunity for kind of a collaborative approach to this, as opposed to defining sectors and the finger pointing that sometimes goes along with that. We really feel, I think, at the college that this is an opportunity for a collaborative solution to the problem that involves partnerships. And we've been happy in the last several years to play, a leadership role in facilitating partnerships with all of the entities represented at this table, and are pretty happy with where we are right now with the leadership within the state and the agencies and the secretaries, along with Secretary Dunn, to lead us forward into the Phase 3 WIP. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the items that we've been involved with in the last year or two, and how we kind of see a trajectory moving into the future. One of the things, obviously, we can provide as a land-grant institution on this issue is research and extension work related to water quality and agriculture in particular, as well as stormwater. And a good example of that is the study that Dr. Patterson is doing on poultry that Chris had mentioned in his remarks. Another good example is the farm survey that we led to help document conservation practices. And we note that that was generously funded by DEP and involved the partnership of really the DEP, Department of Ag, and many, many others, including all of those at this table, to develop that survey and really get the word out and have such a good response rate. A couple major take-homes from that, really, we have for the first time that good story that we can tell about farmers that are using their own dollars out of their own pocket to implement these BMPs. It provides a more complete picture of what has gone on in the ground, not a full picture, but a more complete picture, in that we got these practices counted in the Bay model through the hard work of DEP, and particularly working with EPA. And we worked with the Bay program and EPA and the partnership to really get this methodology approved, so that we could use this in the future potentially to, along with some of the other the other tools that are out there, like the remote sensing work that NRCS led as a pilot in the Potomac, so that in the future, I think, and as a part of the Phase 3 WIP, we need to look at these successful pilots and how can we scale these up to really fully capture what's going on the ground from a voluntary standpoint. Secretary Redding had mentioned Pennsylvania and the balance. And we were very happy to partner with the others at this table and many others to put on a dialogue about a year and a half ago in Hershey, knowing that this Phase 3 WIP was coming up and on the horizon, about agriculture and water quality, and what can we do to be innovative in our thinking and really look to agriculture as the solution to this and as the leadership in solving this problem. And it was a great forum in that we actually had work groups. We had EPA officials sitting with farmers at the same table, wrestling through these issues. And really, what came out of it, I think, was a culture of stewardship that exists within our agricultural community that we can really tap into as being on the forefront of leadership in solving these problems. We have a couple key initiatives coming out of that. One of which is looking at enhancing the conservation training so that we can get more professionals with technical assistance and the ability to help the farmers develop their plans. We just rolled out and have available this fall semester for the first time an Ag Conservation and Stewardship Certificate program to our four-year majors that are interested in these careers. And that will conclude with a capstone internship or work experience program with conservation professional entities like private sector consultants or conservation districts. There is under development through the leadership of Department of Agriculture a recognition and certification program that recognizes those farmers who have implemented conservation holistically across their farms, and hopefully we can build, what we like to build is some incentives into that might be market-based incentives, it might be regulatory-based incentives down the road. Another major initiative is the idea of priority watersheds and targeting. We've heard a lot of the panelists talk about that, the importance of, from a cost-effective standpoint, figuring out the right places to implement the right practices that are most cost-efficient and work well with the farmer's operations and bottom line. And we've done some studies at Penn State following up on the cost study, where we've actually modeled these kind of approaches in small watersheds and found that we can implement and meet our reductions fairly cost effectively if we're really smart about how we do it. So in closing, I would say these are the kind of things that we look forward to tackling in the planning of the Phase 3 WIP. I want to say I think that the agencies, and particularly under DEP's leadership, have set up a pretty good process and structure for this, and look forward to some really hard work and conversations over the next year. So thank you.
Thank you all for your comments. We have about 15 minutes for some questions here, so we have a few more people that want to ask them. So if we kind of keep them short and concise, I'd appreciate it so we can get as many asks as we could in the next 15 or 20 minutes. Senator Street.
Good morning. Close enough? Good morning. Thank you for all being here and your service and your various capacities. There's been a lot of talk about providing assistance to farmers, but I haven't heard a lot of talk about specific programs that will help farmers with either nutrient management or sediment recapture programs. Could someone speak to those programs, the impact, some of what some specific programs would be, whether there are, what the impact of implementation of those programs might be to productivity, and finally, are there sufficient governmental resources to effectively implement those programs on a scale that allow farms to continue to be productive and us to meet our WIP guidelines?
Well, I think thank you. It's a great question, right? So you're asking about sort of what are we doing? What are the plans, specific plans? What are the benefits of those plans? What are the resources available for that? So part one, specifically the requirements for a nutrient management plan and an Ag E&S plan, and I think Brenda Shamball and others have mentioned that. So they're the two foundational plans required. So when we talk about sort of 60% of the farms within that survey having plans, you've got 40% that don't have those base plans, okay? In terms of the benefits of the plans, they're multiple. I think the piece that I go back to Matt Royer talking about the PA and the balance on one of the panels that we had at that conference were producers talking about the benefits of their conservation plan. And it was probably the most important conversation because they were talking about the integration of that plan into the business plan of the farm. And I really thought it was a great conversation because it wasn't sort of an ad hoc piece, right? It really was embedded in decisions they make of crop rotation and crop practices, and it was really a good reminder of why the plans are required and the real value of having the plan in place. There are other plans, practices around that, particularly, to get a plan in place, such as no-till and the cover crops. There are documented values of those practices, and we can certainly provide that to you. The more difficult question is sort of, are the resources there? And we've touched on this in various forms today. The short answer is no, not to get the job done. And whether you use the Penn State study or you just simply do, some simple division by number of plans and number of farms and et cetera, there's a gap in there. And how do you close that gap, I think, is the piece that requires, further conversation of what the state can do specifically. It also requires us to talk about what the expectations of the USDA and EPA are per the federal requirements. I think it's worth noting, when you look at the pie chart, we've made great progress when it comes to the municipal systems. But we spent $1 billion in Pennsylvania to bring the municipal systems up to speed, right? And it's worth noting that piece, if it were $1 billion for agriculture, this issue goes away. I'm not saying it takes $1 billion, but just to put it in perspective, when you look at the pie chart and contribution, there's a lot of money, whether it be voluntary dollars that we know are being spent, it's just good practice, or if it's going to take dollars to put plans and then, of course, the actual on the farm practice. Final point would be we are celebrating 10 years of the REAP tax credit. And we just recognize some folks this week, and we say that that's been one of those great stories where you spend $67 million in tax credits over the last 10 years. Of the tax credits issued, 61% have been for equipment. Of that equipment, 85% have been no-till equipment. And really amazing benefits. And we've been asked about how to quantify that. But I think that's the type of discussion you're asking, Senator, about what do you need to do and how do you get these plans and pay for these plans and practices. So I appreciate your question. Thank you.
If I may. Just briefly to address sort of the unmet need, one other quick figure is that within the Bay Watershed here in Pennsylvania, last year there were $100 million worth of applications going to USDA for their EQIP program, and only $20 million was available to award. So that's, 4 unmet applications for every one, and that's just the farmers voluntarily coming forward and wanting assistance with conservation on their land. So in addition to the economic studies out there, this is information from the farmers themselves as far as what their interests and needs are.
Representative Zimmerman.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel and the secretaries for your input this morning. Good morning. The one question that keeps coming up for me, and I hear a lot of conversation about this, and that is the whole idea and notion of public-private partnerships. While there's a lot of talk, I don't see very many of those in place that are actually working and functioning. And so the question to the departments here is, where are you at on public-private partnerships and the support of them, helping to implement those, encourage them, and so forth? So that's my first question.
Sure. So I think we're very supportive, and in particular, one of the things we've been having a lot more conversations about are market-based solutions. How do we bring more private financing to this? If you go to our website, we have a priority map, and some of that was because some of the stakeholders were asking about, but some of that was so we could use as a tool in approaching funders and others in figuring that. In terms of the specifics, one of the things I've been very encouraged by and encouraging of is we had a project outside of the Bay Watershed, unfortunately, in the southwestern part of the state, where a private company went in, did wetland stream restoration project, created wetland mitigation bank, was able to sell those credits for some other. So I think there's structures and examples of structures we can put in place. That's being looked at right now in York County as one example of an area where they're looking at how can we do this. And the advantage of that, just to put it into the wetland, stormwater, flood protection kind of framework, is in that particular scenario in Southwest, they end up restoring 40 miles of stream through this project, as opposed to a series of quarter-acre, half-acre, 1 acre, one-off wetland projects that don't deliver all of the things that the kind of larger scale restoration project delivered. So I think there's a significant opportunity there. We have to figure out how to make the math of that work and engage everybody to both encourage the private investment, bring the costs down, encourage the public side to participate in that.
I appreciate that, because what I hear is that a number of these projects are being talked about and considered, but it's extremely difficult to have them approved, and I think that's a challenge for the department. Moving on to another question, the model that's been in place, it really is outdated. It's not fair to farmers. Farmers are not getting the credit that they should for the good work that they're doing, and I know there's lots of work being done on that. Where's it actually at in timeline?
So I'll turn it over to Nikki in a second. The one thing I would say off the top is when we use the word credit, I always say there's a number of versions of that. So, to go back to the survey, we went out, did some work, got credit for that. NRCS has been doing some remote sensing work, doing the work they need to get credit within the model. That all said, the one thing that's changed in the model here very recently is inclusion of actual stream data. Before it was just collection of practices and what the impacts of that might be. Mm-hmm. They're bringing more of the in-stream data into it. And one of the things I've said throughout is, even if there's some things that are relatively, on our end, low transaction costs that we can do that we know are going to have an impact, broad education, those kinds of things, that's going to be something that we see in the watershed. Whether or not I know that on this farm they implemented that today, we're going to see that in terms of our water quality results. I don't know, Nikki, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, the Bay Program Partnership is putting an extensive amount of resources into improvements into the watershed and the Bay Program model. This whole midpoint assessment, the biggest thing is cleaning up the historical data that went into it, taking all that monitoring data that we talked about, recalibrating the model to that monitoring data, re-looking at how that's simulated. They also put an extensive amount of resources into a new, very fine level detail land use, fine meter, remote sensing land use data layer to then redo the whole land use. So I'm really encouraged with the state of the model, the accuracy of the model. We're in the final stages of reviewing where the results are coming out of the model, looking at, does it do what we think it should be doing? Is it simulating what we think it should be doing? There were over 400 panels looking at different BMPs and the efficiencies of those BMPs. So there's another larger suite of BMPs and tools that we have. The efficiencies of all those practices have been reviewed. So we have a larger number of suite of practices. We have a better understanding of what those efficiencies are. They've all been incorporated. So I'm really excited about the condition of the understanding we have of the science and the resources that have been put into not only the model, but the other tools that we have available to us that can be used in partnership with the model, not only for GIS and monitoring and et cetera, that are going to be at our fingertips to help us answer the questions that we need to answer. So it's not just the model, but there's a number of other tools as well that we're going to have to use.
Right, but is there an actual date for the model, a target date?
Yeah, we're looking at the final fatal flaw review now, where we hope to have had the final model before, I believe, early September is my recollection. The goal is to have the final model ready to go to where they can start running the numbers so that we have actual planning numbers by October to start looking at in a draft form.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator DeLissia.
The goals this morning was to help educate this committee on some of the nuances of this. I certainly have been much more educated and absolutely appreciate that. A few of my questions have been answered, but I just want to say I'm very sympathetic to those farmers in particular who have had to make major changes over the past decade and going forward into how they conduct business and now have to incorporate this into them. And just want to share that I think whenever that happens, we need to be not only sympathetic, empathetic, and certainly never have a gotcha type of mentality to bring people along, PennDOT has recently implemented, and it's very recent, they're still trying to figure it out, something called PennDOT Connects. And it's a way to bring citizens in particular and stakeholders into the process from Jump Street, not like once they have a preliminary idea or plan. And having gone through a few things in my district over the past 2 years, 3 years, I see where this program has many, many pluses to it. So the idea and the concept of including particularly being good listeners, you know, what is this like from that person's perspective who's literally, in this case, in the field? And I'm sure you're doing your best for that. But I find we can always do better, and I find that is really the difference between having an okay program and an outstanding program where we can get people vested in the outcome and move forward with it. And then a quick question for Ms. King. Is there these impaired lakes? Is there also a map that shows the degrees of impairment and/or another map that shows the non-impaired waterways?
This information came from DEP, and there are certainly the full stream maps of Pennsylvania available out there. So perhaps we can work together with some other resources out there to get you that complete map.
Yeah, you can get a map. You can get the map any number of ways as far as break it down by the source of impairment, the streams that are not impaired. The biggest summary is in it happens every 2 years. It's called the 305B report. It's a complete summary of that. So that's on our website. So we have to do that every 2 years as a complete comprehensive assessment of all the waters, streams, lakes in the state.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
These red areas represent about a quarter, almost.
Can I add two additional points? And since I've given some historical perspective today, I'd like to go prior to 1985. Over the previous 20-year period, farmers on their own, without regulatory directives, made significant improvements in environmental quality on their farms. So, I mean, that's a plus. I echo the need, and I think, EPA has recognized the need for local buy-in in the finalization of TMDL reductions. Just because I'm the parent and I give a direction to my children, it doesn't mean my children listen. It seems parents are more effective when they're able to get their children to buy in to what the parents are doing. And I will say, relative to 2010, EPA has been more cognizant and more willing to recognize, and that's part of the directive, the expectation for Pennsylvania, that there be procedures, processes, buy-in from local communities, and that way everyone will benefit. So.
I'm sorry we ran out of time here this morning. It was a great discussion. I want to thank all our panelists. I want to thank the secretaries that were here. I want to thank all the members that came as well. I mean, great discussion. Obviously, it's something we have to continue discussing going forward. We have the goals to meet by 2025, so it's going to take stakeholders from all sides, the legislature as well included, to meet our goals and everyone. So I want to thank everyone for coming today, and enjoy the rest of your day here at Ag Progress Days. Thank you.